Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank particularly Benita Sussman for inviting me to come along today. And as she's just mentioned, traveling with her and discussing these issues with her over many years has been an incredible experience. And as some of you know, I'm from a Christian background. And, when I think of Benita, I almost automatically and instinctively think of the kind of colonial stories about amazing Christian female missionaries who, struggled through the bush to bring enlightenment and the gospel and so on to various native populations. She's not exactly doing the same thing. She's not into conversion, but my goodness, she certainly shows grit, determination, incredible courage, despite various handicaps that she might have. So really, as they say, kol hakavod to Benita for her amazing work. Now, it's kind of easy to get carried away. And I really am going to make an effort today not to get carried away. So before we start thinking about the explosion of, Jewish or Judaizing communities throughout the world, I'd like to sort of recap what we historically know about the Sephardi diaspora. Then I'll move on to the topic that we're looking at today, namely Africa and the Americas, and what we actually know about the origin of Jewish communities in those areas. Then I'll move on to the larger issue of emerging Jewish communities and how they're presenting in these areas. And then I'll say something about DNA and genetics, the kind of origins of which, as Benita recalled, I played a small role there some 20 odd years ago with the Lemba. And then I'll try and make some kind of conclusions about what this all means. Well, first of all, the kind of conventional knowledge about the Sephardi diaspora is perfectly well known. Everybody here probably knows a good deal more about it than I do. But after the expulsions of 1492 and 1497, most of the Jews who left the Iberian Peninsula went to North Africa. There were ships, of course, going from the ports that took them there, and from there they moved on to Italy and to the what became the Ottoman Empire, and were to be found in places like Constantinople and then Salonika and so on and so forth. All this is quite well known. In the case of Africa outside North Africa, rather less is known, and it's only really quite recently that people have been interested in the wider sort of dispersion of Jews in parts of South America and Central America. Although, of course, there were certain aspects of this diaspora that were reasonably well known and have been very well studied. So let's start with Africa, East and West Africa. I don't think very much was known about the existence of Jews, Sephardi Jews, in West Africa until round about the turn of the century. And then there was some pretty impressive work by Tobias Green, Peter Mark, Jose da Silva Horta, and a couple of other people who pointed to the existence of a number of communities in the 16th century that inhabited the coast of Senegambia, and particularly the area of what's called La Petite Côte. And these books are extremely interesting, and not only do they point to the existence of Sephardi Jews who intermarry but maintain some kind of a discernible, recognizable Jewish profile in those areas for maybe as long as 100 years. They kind of peter out, and it might be worth just spending a little minute or two. Hello? It seems to have stopped working. Is it working? Yeah? Okay, good. So what happened to them? We do know that there were probably half a dozen communities, as I say, in Senegambia, and then we didn't hear very much about them. Well, it could be that they moved. There was a kind of triangular movement of people involved in trade to Amsterdam and to Brazil, under the auspices of what's known as the Nassau, of these Sephardi trading complexes that were very dominant in certain areas of commerce, including slavery. And they simply kind of merged into the local population, and that's the end of that. I mean, that's one possibility. The other possibility is that they stayed on in some kind of subterranean way, and we don't really have very much evidence about that. But intriguingly, in the eastern part of Senegal, in the area of Gaudiri, if you want to look it up on a map, there is, to this very day, a community which is called the Bani Israel, and they've got rather misty legends about a sacred tree that sprouts in the middle of their capital village. I don't think it's quite a city. And this tree was allegedly planted by Jacob, and whereas they're Muslims, they say that they are descended from Jews. They've got a pretty complex story of origin, whereby they crossed from the land of Israel and went to Nigeria, and then they moved north. The reality is, as we know from various sources, is that they came up the river Niger probably a few hundred years ago, and it's entirely conceivable that they owe their ethnogenesis to some kind of Jewish presence on the west coast of Africa. That's a possibility. But who knows? It could be the case, and I've been trying to persuade PhD students for a while to go to eastern Senegal and do some research on the subject. My own work over a few years has also pointed to the existence of Sephardi individuals or small groups who lived on the west coast of Africa, and there's very fleeting mention to them in the travel literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. Not very much, but it's clear that there were Sephardi Jews living in West Africa. And of course, further south, there are quite a number of conversos living south of in the southern part of the continent. Recently, I made a rather random discovery, which gave birth, in fact, to a book published by Oxford a couple of years ago, which is in Loango. Now, Loango you probably won't have heard of, but it's a rather well-organized little kingdom with peculiar habits, which was in West Africa, well south of Nigeria, in what is today Gabon. So I was reading this 18th century German text, And a curious passage jumped off the page of this text. It was in German, written by a missionary, and the missionary had been sent to the West Indies to basically to write a sort of history of one of the missionary movements in the West Indies. I won't go into any detail, it's irrelevant here. But so he's interviewing slaves who are working for the missions in this particular place. And one of the slaves mentioned that in the place from which he was from, this kingdom of Loango, there were Jews who had various habits, one of which is that they didn't speak on Shabbat, and that they didn't really mix with the other Negroes, and that what else happened? Oh yes, and they had their separate graveyard, and on the graves there were images of snakes and lizards. This is quite unexpected for a Jewish cemetery, to find images of snakes and lizards. And the other thing was that they didn't eat with the Negroes. I'm using the word because that's the word in German in the original source in the area. So this was very intriguing, not least because 2 or 3 years before I'd written what was supposedly a definitive work on the Jewish communities of Black Africa, and I had failed miserably to mention the existence of any Jewish community in Loango. So I got intrigued and started doing a bit of research on this community and discovered that they really had an incredible impact upon the way that Europe was thinking at the time about all sorts of issues to do with colour and race and other things. So this is one community. I mean, we know pretty much where this community came from. They had been expelled. There were hundreds of orphans who'd found their way from Spain to Portugal, and from Portugal they'd been sent to one of the Portuguese colonies, and from there they had somehow moved their way down to Loango, and just north of the Congo River. Long before it had been colonized. It was only colonized at the end of the 19th century. And these people lived there for hundreds of years, and we don't really know very much about what they did or what they thought, or even particularly what they looked like, although a German team that was sent there, a German exploratory team that was doing ethnographic work in Western Africa, said that they looked Jewish, whatever that means, and there is some suggestion that they may have had some Jewish practices. So this is one group. So we've seen Senegambia in the northwest, and then way down as far as the Congo, you have another group, clearly of Sephardi origin, that had merged pretty much into the local population, but maintained a kind of distinct profile. So quite interesting. We have two communities there. There's possibly another group in Mozambique, about which we know far, far less, but really not awfully much. So what's quite interesting is that, and I'll be talking about the wider phenomenon towards the end of my talk, but it's quite interesting that today, precisely in the place where this community in Loango lived, as I said, it's Gabon, there is an emerging Jewish community, and in the way of such communities, they come up with some sort of historical narrative that will kind of explain who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, and what they're doing as a sort of Judaism. And the story that they associate then with their own past is a story which is in fact, plucked from the actual history of the black Jews of Loango. So what happened to them? In the case of Senegal, they kind of disappeared, may or may not have something to do with the Bani Israel in the eastern part of Senegal. In the case of Loango, it was a rather similar story, because we can just about piece together the fact that when the French came and took over the commerce of the coastal area in the 1880s, the Jews who lived there, or the possibly Jews who lived there, and who had been involved in trade and were relatively prosperous and lived by then in their own villages, distinct villages, moved inland. And what happened when they moved inland? They went as far as the rainforest, and they kind of formed some sort of relationship with a pygmy population, who intriguingly were referred to by the French-speaking people of the area, because it was a French colony, everybody knows French, and so they're called les Juifs. So they call the pygmies les Juifs, and the descendants of the Loango black Jews form some kind of relationship with the Juifs, with the pygmies, and they kind of intermarry, and they've sort of disappeared into the rainforest. Now we don't really know any more than that. And again, as soon as I have an intrepid student who's prepared to go to the rainforest and do some very original and interesting research, this would be a very good place for them to go. So today we have all of these quite well organized communities in Gabon, and there's an absolutely outstanding book by Nathan de Vere, which has just come out, which is called First Century Christians in Gabon and Madagascar, pretty much. And he's not really talking about first century Christians. He's talking about Jewish communities in Gabon and Madagascar who arrive at Judaism through, first of all, some Christian faith, and then through some sort of messianic Christian faith, and then the messianic Christian faith morphs into Judaism, which can be more or less orthodox and more or less tinged by association with an imagined Sephardi past or present. And so in the case of this community, how do they explain their origins? I mean, it's not in this case that they recall their grandmothers having candlesticks lit on Friday night and things of that sort. It is rather that they know that their ancestors moved from the coast where they'd practiced for hundreds of years, and they intermarried with the pygmies of the rainforest. And whether this is true kind of memories, or whether this is something picked up from the internet and indeed from my book, I do not know. It could be either. So this is then the actual history of the Sephardi, if you like, penetration of West Africa. Over and above that, I mean, there are other bits of the world which also have an actual history with respect to Sephardi communities, which is not usually recorded in the traditional history of the Sephardi diaspora. And Indonesia is one of them. I was recently there doing field work, and this was fascinating. It's not really part of my topic today, but it seems relevant just to make some reference to it. And there is really a kind of, sense that from Amsterdam, which of course was a great Sephardi center, with the growth of the Dutch Empire, then some Jews could, at different points, travel freely enough to the East Indies and establish themselves there. And in the course of time, they intermarried, went subterranean, if you like, or didn't, and then in recent years have emerged as what we might refer to as emerging Jewish communities. But there seems to be a kind of there seems to be a sort of historical basis to this, and it's very intriguing to see how far this has spread, even to, Bonita mentioned Papua New Guinea. Well, we went there in 2013, I think it was, and that was quite intriguing. We spent some time with the Gogodali, which I'd visited a few times over the years. But in the western part of the great island of Papua, there are now some very, very well-populated communities, both in the west and in the north of the western part of the island, which have got, which are functioning as Jewish communities, and the Sephardi Jewish communities, and which claim some sort of a origin via a migration of conversos from Peru. Whether this is true or not is beyond the scope of this particular talk. So that brings me to the second part of my talk. This is what we kind of know historically, and I said we don't need to get carried away. And basically we don't really know very much outside the well-known islands and so on that have had an actual Sephardi history, if you like, for hundreds of years, which are very, of course, very interesting. But in recent times, there's been a global phenomenon of which our thoughts today form part. A Pew report a few years ago mentioned that in the United States of America, of people who self-describe as being religious, over half started life as something else. So they might say, well, I'm religious and I'm a Jew, but I started off as a Methodist. Or I'm religious and I'm a Muslim, and I started off as, I don't know, a Catholic or a Buddhist, whatever. So in other words, nationally, throughout the United States, there's an incredible movement in terms of religious affiliation. And it doesn't take a genius to realize that the freedom that people have in terms of religious self-identification is linked in a powerful way with the freedom that people have in terms of gender, gender identification, sexual identification, and even racial identification. It's been a moment, this moment in history has been the most freeing in many respects of any moment in the whole of human history. And so the development throughout the world, this explosion of self-identifying Jewish communities, I suppose, would you not agree, forms part of this wider phenomenon, which of course doesn't in any way invalidate it. And when I come to the conclusion of my lecture, you will see what my own position on this is. Genetics forms a part of the explosion in Jewish identification as far as the Sephardi world is concerned. And for this I must take some slight responsibility, I suppose. So, my story on genetics is this. I was faced with a bit of a conundrum in Africa with a Jewish community called the Lemba, who live in South Africa and Zimbabwe. This is 20 odd years ago, and I wasn't really able to prove or disprove their claim to be of Jewish origin. There were all kinds of things, ethnographic things, and so on, which looked as if it might point towards a Jewish origin. And then there were various things that didn't, but there wasn't any kind of written record, there wasn't any real evidence, it was all rather up in the air. And I became kind of rather obsessed with trying to find out the truth of the origin of this community, and eventually, when I was in South Arabia, having discovered, I think, the place from which they originally came, I decided that it would be a good idea to make a comparison between the DNA of the people living in this part of South Arabia, from which I believe they may once have come, and the centres of this population in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And it turned out that there was a very, very distinct overlap, and that, along with various other ethnographic elements, seemed to prove, in a way, where this community had come from. So it was really quite exciting. I went on to do a similar thing with the Bnei Israel in Western Africa, in Western India, which again had got rather murky origins, and the genetic profile that we were able to establish sort of helped to pinpoint where they had come, and rather nicely in their case, it seemed to offer the first evidence in history that they indeed did have some sort of a Jewish origin. So it was a lot of fun, and it was really rather positive stuff, because people who wanted to be Jewish but hadn't been recognized properly as being Jewish were, given something to hang on to. It was a bit more evidence. So since then, of course, things have moved on, and genetics is still in its infancy, but everybody, can now go to one of the commercial sites and get their genome read in a rather primitive way. And so, people think that you can, am I Sephardi? Am I Ashkenazi? What am I? I can go to one of these sites and I can find out. Well, let me tell you, you can't. It doesn't work that way. So, according to enthusiasts, there are hundreds of millions of people throughout South America, Central America, and the Iberian Peninsula who have got Sephardi DNA. It's not true. What people have is some kind of DNA which associates them with a place. It doesn't associate them with a culture, and it doesn't associate them with a religion. Just think, if you look at the kind of the Jewish genome, I did an article with many other people. I was just the historian, they were the real scholars in this, in 2010, which was published in Nature. It was quite an important thing, and I was very proud to be associated with it. And it did show very unequivocally that the Jewish population of the world shares, at least on the male side, not on the female side, but on the male side, it shows that everybody originated in a particular part of the world. And that's what genetics can basically do. It can say more or less where your great-great-great are from, more or less. The only problem with this is that in the case of the Jewish genome, it starts, as you would expect, in the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and so the profile is pretty much the same as Lebanon, Eastern Cyprus, the Druze population, and the Palestinian population. There's no real distinction between these things, with a couple of elements, right? Now, if you're thinking about, really? If you're thinking about the Iberian Peninsula, and you've got a population, let's say in Colombia, and so the person in Colombia goes along, gets his DNA done. He says, "Hey, look, I'm Sephardi." Well, it could be. It could easily be that this is the origin, but it could easily not be that it's the origin, because you have to think a little bit about the prehistory of Spain and this area. So first of all, we have to remember that the Phoenicians were in Spain before Jewish populations came with the Muslim armies. They were also in Carthage, so lots of people in North Africa can be expected to have Phoenician DNA, if you like. And so this goes way back, and you wouldn't really be able to determine where this is from. So is it from Phoenicians? Is it from Moors? You know, is it from Moors or is it from Jews? It really could be from any one of these groups, or I suppose from none, because there are plenty of people living in and around the Mediterranean who've got similar markers. So it's for the moment, of course, it's in its infancy, but for the moment it's very, very imprecise, and it's not really awfully helpful in many respects. So, the idea, therefore, that there are hundreds of millions of Sephardim, that one can prove through genomics, I think should be probably discounted. So to conclude, where does that leave us? The kind of profile that I've seen, and I don't want to be a wet blanket, in my recent travels throughout the world, and this includes Puerto Rico and Colombia and Nicaragua, I suppose, and certainly Indonesia and definitely Africa, is that people are coming to a considered decision to become Jewish, in most cases from a Christian background, and the decision to become Jewish is marked by a dissatisfaction with Christianity, either because Christianity is associated with colonialism, or because Christianity is somehow associated with racism, or because Christianity is not really true to what it sets out to be, or that it really is not a very satisfying religion for the people concerned. Usually what happens is that people, let's say, start off with Catholicism, in the case of Central and South America. They get fed up with it. There's no direct connection with God. People don't seem to be interested in the text. Where is the Bible? We're fed up with this ritual. We're fed up with priests doing unspeakable things with small boys. All of this, and they kind of think, it's not for us. And of course, in the case of places like Brazil, which until 30 years ago was 100% Catholic, now it's 55% evangelical, Pentecostal. And it's from these evangelical and Pentecostal groups that the majority of seekers, if you like, or would-be Jews are drawn as a profile. I'm not saying that there aren't many others who don't follow this pattern, but this is undoubtedly the majority pattern. Again, I've heard the same very sad story, really, on so many occasions that I cannot discount it. I'm not doing quantitative work. I'm doing strictly qualitative work, and so I can't put figures to it. But you get to the point, or one of these individuals gets to the point that they realize that their evangelical faith, which becomes more and more Jewish as they try and achieve a kind of authenticity which is true to the text, is leading them inevitably, inexorably to a Jewish faith, and they become sort of Jewish, and they're delighted. They think, wow, we've solved it. That's who we really are. We feel good with this. We feel great with this. We're Jews. Very often, we are Sephardi Jews. And so at this point, what do? They go along to the first Jewish community that they can find, wherever it may be. And they proclaim with great joy and excitement that they are Jewish. And the Jewish community that they visit is much less joyous than they are. And they're not very enthusiastic about it at all. And basically they say, go away and leave us alone. They may be slightly more sympathetic than that, but generally speaking, they're not. Chabad, which is everywhere, as you know, is certainly not at all sympathetic to any of these groups. And they're rude, unpleasant, and dismissive, unquestionably. So they go back to their community, and they're disappointed, and they haven't created the effective bridge that they had hoped to find, or get the support that they hoped to get in different ways to do with, let's say, kosher food or ritual objects or whatever it may be. And so then they kind of think, well, yeah, I suppose, we don't, to be Jewish, you've got to be Jewish. And, you've got to have a Jewish mother, you've got to be ethnically Jewish, you've got to be racially Jewish, to use that term very much in inverted commas. And so this is the point, always this is the point where a legend is created, a narrative is created, which can associate them with a Jewish past, with a Jewish history, and very often this is via conversos. It can be in different things in different parts of the world, but it always follows this pattern on the basis of the research that I've done so far anyway. So as a historian who is not supposed to be touched, by the emotional weight of the things that he or she is concerned with, you have to look at the legends, and you have to look at the narratives, and you have to really say, well, is there any likely historicity to these stories? And very often it's so interesting that you speak with rational people, people who haven't really given Judaism a thought for hundreds and hundreds of years, who with their parents never heard the word Jew mentioned, where there was no real discernible, objective kind of activity that you could honestly associate with the Jewish remnant, not to be truly honest. But it's sufficient for people then to form an identity which is sort of Judaic. And that's the point that interested me. It's this moment of accepting something which is inherently not very convincing or not very likely, and turning it into something which is entirely convincing, entirely historical, and the basis of their future, and the future of their children, and the future of their children's children. In other words, it is the formation in our time of a powerful, incredible myth. And so I conclude, and I hope I haven't gone over my 5 minutes, so I conclude that the legend, I think both the DNA legend and I think the more kind of anthropological legend, from my perspective anyway, in many, many cases, not in all cases, is something really in the realm of faith. It is part and parcel of religious faith. It is part of meta-history, it is not really entirely part of history. So thank you very much. Two questions really fast. Does anybody have a question? Yeah. I can't hear. I'm as deaf as a post.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Daniel Coleman. I'm a rabbi at Yeshiva University, uptown in New York. A little closer. I'm just curious, this was really fascinating, and I'm just curious if you could give us a little window into how you got interested and excited in this particular area, particularly as you're someone from outside of the Jewish faith, so I'm kind of curious your interest and excitement about this area.
Well, thank you. Yes, it is kind of intriguing. It's not a decision that I have ever regretted. And people are kind of surprised that somebody who's not Jewish is doing Jewish studies, but they don't show the same surprise when, let's say, an American is a professor of French or French history or something like that. Well, I certainly think that Jewish history is just as interesting as French history, and it really is the most amazing field to be in. And the reason that I got into it in the first instance was because I happened to be sent as a volunteer to Israel when I was 19 before I went to university. And I then switched subjects from my beloved history to Hebrew and Arabic Oriental studies while I was there. And I did a PhD, on an aspect of Middle Eastern Jewish history. And then the way, chance plays such a role, doesn't it, in one's academic life. And in 1984, I was asked to go to the Sudan because the rumor was that Ethiopian Jews were being poisoned in the refugee camps. People were fleeing the great 1984 famine in Ethiopia, including hundreds, thousands of Ethiopian Jews. And my visit to do my, study for the minority rights group coincided with the Israeli Operation Moses. And so, long story short, when it was permissible to write about it, I eventually did. I wrote a book, and that kind of took me into sort of, Jewish communities in Africa, and that took me into Lemba, and somehow Lemba in some weird way took me into, Jews and genetics. And then I've done other stuff as well, different kinds of aspects of Jewish history. But I suppose it really all started with working in a place just outside Jerusalem called Akvar Shvedi, the Swedish village. And once a week, it was my job to go with the social worker, a dear woman by the name of Lola Zinger, who was a social worker, and she had to visit the parents of the children who were in this rather dreadful institution. And so I traveled all over the country, meeting Jews from Kurdistan and from Afghanistan and from Iran and from any place you could begin to think of. And so at the end of the year, I really had a very acute sense of what the Jewish diaspora was all about, and particularly the eastern end of it. And I was utterly and completely intrigued and utterly and completely hooked, and I'm still hooked. So thank you for the question. Any other question? Yeah.
You use the word myth, and I find that myth has various different connotations that come along with it. Can you briefly define what you mean when you say something is a myth?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, myth is it's not it's not what people, I think, commonly think of as myth. I mean, myth for a lot of people is just something that's not true, right? A myth is very true. It can be very true, and it can reveal truths which are not necessarily discernible by other means, and it's incredibly powerful. So, people talk about Jews talk about the Jewish spark, that there is a kind of metaphysical Jewish spark which emerges, in mysterious ways after many generations in alien societies. I suppose that's a kind of myth, isn't it? But there may be some truth to it. Lost Tribes of Israel, that's a thing that I've really been associated with. I've written a book on the myth of the Lost Tribes of Israel. There's nothing untrue about it. I mean, it's not, it's a real thing that people believe in the idea of the Lost Tribes of Israel. It's as real as things come, and incredibly potent, very powerful. It's very similar, if you like, to the myth of race. Race is a complete myth, but in this particular society of the United States of America, what myth could possibly be more powerful and true and real than that? It's not based in history, and it's not based in, well, it may be based in history, but it's not based in biology, which is where it's supposed to be based, if you see what I mean. Thank you.